They say the mirrors in our homes are the only ones who truly know our secrets. They see us when the makeup comes off, when the forced smiles fade, and when we think no one is watching. My name is Elena, and for a long time, the mirror was my only confidant. At 39, I had managed to hold on to a youthfulness that felt like a quiet rebellion against time. I wasn't just holding up well, I was thriving physically. Every morning, I dedicated myself to the ritual of maintenance, the long runs at dawn, the disciplined skincare, the careful choices at every meal. It wasn't just vanity. In a house that felt increasingly like a hollow museum, my reflection was the only thing I could still control. My husband, Julian, used to be the one to remind me of my beauty. He'd wrap his arms around my waist and whisper how lucky he was. But Julian was a man of industry, a man whose soul seemed to have been slowly replaced by spreadsheets and executive decisions. Lately, his compliments felt like something he was reading off a teleprompter, delivered with a distracted gaze before he retreated back into his home office or left for another essential business trip. The morning everything began to shift was unnervingly quiet. Julian had vanished into the gray light of 5 a.m., leaving behind nothing but the scent of expensive cologne and the lingering coldness of his side of the bed. I cherished these hours. The house, a sprawling minimalist structure of glass and steel, felt less like a cage when I was the only one moving through it. I decided to indulge in a long, scalding shower to wash away the lethargy of another lonely night. I remember the steam filling the room, blurring the sharp edges of the marble. I applied a charcoal mask, feeling the tighten of the clay on my skin, and let the water beat against my shoulders until my skin turned a soft pink. When I stepped out, I felt a surge of defiant confidence. I reached into the back of my drawer and pulled out a set of crimson silk lingerie, something I had bought months ago, hoping to stir a fire in Julian that had long since burned down to cold ash. It was bold, delicate, and made me feel like a woman who was still very much alive. I stood before the vanity, towel drying my hair, and wiped the black mask from my face. I looked at myself, really looked at myself, and wondered how a man could have all of this and still prefer the company of a laptop screen. I was lost in that thought, a mix of pride and simmering resentment. When the door, which I had neglected to latch, properly swung open, I froze. I expected to see Julian, perhaps returned for a forgotten file. But the person standing there was Leo. Leo was Julian's son from his first marriage, a 24-year-old who had recently moved back into the guest wing after a disastrous attempt at starting a tech firm in another city. He was a quiet, brooding presence in the house, someone I usually navigated around like a piece of furniture. But in that moment, he was very much a living, breathing person. Our eyes locked in, the mirror first, then directly. The silence was heavy, thick with the sudden intrusion of reality into my private world. Leo's face went from pale to a deep, agonizing crimson in a matter of seconds. He stammered something, his voice cracking. Elena, I'm so sorry. I thought ... the light was off. I was coming to check the water pressure. He didn't look away immediately. There was a heartbeat, maybe two, where his gaze lingered on the curve of my waist, the bold red of the silk against my skin. It wasn't the look of a son-in-law. It was the look of a man seeing something he wasn't supposed to see, but couldn't help but admire. I should have screamed. I should have been outraged. But instead, my heart hammered against my ribs with a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. "Knock, Leo," I managed to say, my voice breathy and far less steady than I intended. "Always knock." He backed out, the door clicking shut, but the damage was done. The air in the bathroom felt different charged, electric, and dangerously thin. I sat on the edge of the tub, my hands trembling. Why was I blushing? Why did that? look feel more intimate than anything Julian had given me in 3 years. I tried to tell myself it was just the shock, the embarrassment of the exposure. But as I looked back at the mirror, I saw a woman who looked revitalized. The accident had pierced the veil of my invisibility. For the first time in a long time, someone had truly looked at me. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house shifted from cold to suffocating. Leo avoided me, but I could feel his awareness of me whenever we were in the same room. I'd catch him watching me over the rim of a coffee mug, or he'd suddenly leave the room when I entered. It was a dance of shadows, and the more he pulled away, the more I found myself noticing him. Leo was a younger, more raw version of the man Julian used to be before the corporate world swallowed his heart. He had the same jawline, the same intense eyes, but they were filled with a turbulent emotion rather than cold calculation. I started to wonder what he thought of me. Did he see a mother figure, or did he see the woman in the red silk? The thought was a poison I found myself sipping willingly. Meanwhile, Julian remained a ghost. He returned from his trip only to announce another social obligation. "There's a gala tomorrow night, Elena," he said, not even looking up from his phone as he dropped his keys on the counter. "It's important. Wear that black dress I like. I need to make an impression on the board." That was my role, an accessory, a well-maintained piece of property to be displayed at his side to prove he was a success in every facet of life. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to tell him about the incident with Leo, just to see if he was capable of feeling jealousy or anger or anything at all. But I stayed silent. I nodded like the dutiful wife I had been trained to be. The night of the gala, I went above and beyond. I didn't wear the black dress. I chose a gown the color of a midnight storm, form-fitting and elegant, with a back that dipped dangerously low. I spent hours on my hair and makeup, carving out a version of myself that was impossible to ignore. When I walked down the stairs, Leo was standing in the foyer. He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes tracing the line of the dress. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the words died in his throat. Julian, however, just checked his watch. "You're late," he said. "Let's go. The driver is waiting." No compliment, no lingering gaze, just a schedule to maintain. The evening was a blur of hollow laughter and expensive champagne. I stood by Julian's side as he shook hands and talked about mergers and acquisitions. I felt like a mannequin. Every time I tried to join the conversation, he would gently, almost imperceptibly, steer it away from me, as if my only job was to stand there and look expensive. Halfway through the night, a junior partner approached us. "Julian, a word." Julian turned to me, his expression vacant. "I have a private meeting in the lounge. It might take a while. Why don't you take the car home? I'll catch a ride with Davis later. We have a lot to discuss." I stood there, alone in a room full of people, feeling the familiar sting of abandonment. "You're leaving me here?" I whispered. He didn't even hear me. He was already walking away, his hand on the other man's shoulder, laughing at a joke I wouldn't understand. I walked out of that ballroom with my head held high, but the moment I stepped into the back of the car, the tears started to fall. I wasn't just sad, I was furious. I was 39 years old, in the prime of my life, and I was being treated like a discarded toy. When I arrived back at the house, it was dark. I assumed Leo was out, as he'd mentioned a flight to visit a friend. I kicked off my heels in the hallway, the silence of the mansion feeling like a weight on my chest. I went to the kitchen, seeking the only comfort I could find: a glass of wine and a cigarette I kept hidden from moments of extreme stress. I stood there in my expensive gown, my makeup perfectly intact, feeling like a ghost in my own home. I poured a glass of dark red wine, the color reminding me of the lingerie from a few days prior, and lit the cigarette. The smoke swirled in, the moonlight filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. A floorboard creaked behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Leo was standing in the archway. He wasn't in his travel clothes. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, looking exhausted. "I thought you left," I said, my voice cracking. "Flight was canceled," he said softly. He didn't move toward me, but his gaze was locked on mine. "I was going to tell you, but you were already leaving for the party. You look incredible, Elena." I laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Do I? Because your father didn't seem to notice. He left me there, Leo. He left me at the gala to talk about business. I'm just a trophy he forgets to polish." I took a long drag of the cigarette, the smoke burning my throat. I felt reckless. The wine was hitting my empty stomach, and the years of neglect were bubbling over. I spend so much time trying to be perfect, trying to stay young, trying to be someone worth looking. And it means nothing. Leo took a step closer. The air between us seemed to vibrate. "It doesn't mean nothing to me," he said. His voice was deeper now, stripped of the embarrassment he'd shown in the bathroom. "I haven't been able to think about anything else since the other morning. I see how he treats you. I see how you look when he walks out the door. You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen, and he's a fool for not seeing that every single day." Tears blurred my vision again. This was the validation I had been starving for, but it was coming from the wrong person, or was it? In that moment, the lines of morality and family blurred. I saw a man who saw me. Not a wife, not a stepmother, but Elena. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched his arm. His skin was warm, a stark contrast to the coldness of the house. "Do you mean that?" I whispered. "Every word," he replied. What happened next was a collision of two lonely souls. It wasn't planned. It wasn't a calculated move to hurt Julian. It was an explosion of suppressed emotion. I leaned in, and he met me halfway. The kiss was desperate, tasting of wine and smoke and years of forgotten passion. It was the feeling of coming back to life. We moved through the house like shadows, the world outside ceasing to exist. We ended up in the living room, the moonlight casting long silver streaks across the floor. Everything was frantic and silent at the same time. The silk of my dress, the lace of my underwear, the heat of his skin, it was a sensory overload that drowned out the voice of my conscience. For an hour, I wasn't the neglected wife of a billionaire. I was a woman who was desired. I was a woman who was present. We lay there on the oversized sofa, breathless, the reality of what we had done slowly beginning to settle in the cool air. Leo ran a hand through my hair, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and terror. "What have we done?" he whispered. "I don't know," I said, pulling a blanket over us. "But for the first time in years, I don't feel like I'm disappearing." We were so lost in that fragile post-storm peace that we didn't hear the car pull into the driveway. We didn't hear the heavy thud of the front door or the measured footsteps on the hardwood. The first sign of danger was the sudden, blinding flash of the overhead lights. "Elena," Julian's voice was like a gunshot. We scrambled, a chaotic mess of limbs and fabric, but there was no hiding. Julian stood at the edge of the living room, his tuxedo jacket over his arm, his face a mask of incomprehension that quickly curdled into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He looked from me to his son, his eyes fixating on the discarded clothes on the floor. The silence that followed was more deafening than any scream. "Julian, I started, my voice failing me. "Shut up," he hissed. The word was low, vibrating with a hatred I had never seen in him. "Get up, both of you." He didn't move. He stood there like a judge, his presence filling the room with a cold, suffocating power. Leo stood up, trying to shield me, his face pale. But his jaw set. Dad, listen, it wasn't her fault. I said, shut up. Julian roared, slamming his fist against the doorframe. The sound echoed through the high ceilings. My son, my wife, under my own roof. Do you have any idea what you've done? Do you have any concept of the betrayal? He turned his gaze to me, and it felt like being looked at by a stranger. I gave you everything, this house, this life, this status. And this is how you repay me? With him? A boy who can't even hold down a job? You didn't give me everything, Julian. I screamed. Back, the adrenaline finally overriding the shame. I stood up, wrapping the blanket around me like a shroud. You gave me a cage. You gave me a checkbook and a cold bed. You haven't looked at me in years. You haven't spoken to me as a human being since we signed the prenup. I was a ghost in this house, and you didn't even notice I was dead until someone else tried to wake me up. Julian's face went white. For a moment, I thought he might strike me, but he was too controlled for that. He was a man of contracts and consequences. Get out, he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. What? Leo asked. Get out of this house? Both of you. Now, I don't care where you go. I don't care if you have shoes on your feet. If you are here in 10 minutes, I will have the security team drag you to the curb. You are dead to me. Both of you. He turned on his heel and walked out, the sound of his office door locking being the final period on our marriage. The next few minutes were a blur of frantic movement. We gathered what we could, the clothes we were wearing, a few essentials. I found myself standing on the driveway in the chill of the early morning, wearing a coat over my ruined gala dress, holding a small bag of jewelry and my passport. Leo stood beside me, his backpack slung over one shoulder, looking at the house that was no longer his home. The iron gates groaned as they shut, the electronic lock clicking into place with a finality that made my knees weak. We walked down the long, winding road that led away from the estate. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold dot. We walked in silence for a long time. The weight of the guilt was there, heavy and suffocating, but beneath it was something else. A strange, terrifying sense of lightness. I had lost the house. I had lost the security. I had lost the perfect life that everyone envied. But as I looked at my reflection in the window of a closed cafe we passed, I didn't see the mannequin anymore. I saw a woman who had broken her own world to find a spark of truth. Where do we go now? Leo asked, his voice small. I looked at him. I knew that what we had wasn't a romance that would last a lifetime. It was a bridge, a beautiful, tragic, necessary bridge that had carried us both out of a burning building. We were two broken people who had used each other to escape. We go forward, I said. I reached out and took his hand, not as a lover, but as a survivor. We find a place where we don't have to be what other people want us to be. We start over. As we reached the main road, the city began to wake up. Cars hummed past us, people headed to work, the world indifferent to the drama that had shattered my life. I realized then that Julian hadn't taken everything. He couldn't take my strength, and he couldn't take the fact that I was finally, painfully, beautifully awake. The road ahead was uncertain, and the scandal would likely follow me like a shadow. But for the first time in a decade, the mirror didn't have any more secrets to keep. I was Elena, and I was free. The first few weeks were a descent into a reality I hadn't known since my early 20s. We stayed in a nondescript motel on the edge of the city, the kind of place where the carpet smelled of stale tobacco and the neon sign flickered with an erratic heartbeat. I sold the diamond earrings Julian had given me for our 5th anniversary. Ones he'd had his assistant pick out. The cash felt dirty, but it was the price of our survival. Leo was a shell of himself. The weight of what he had done to his father and what his father had done to him was a burden his young shoulders weren't ready for. We spent long hours talking, not about the night of the gala, but about everything else. He told me about his failed business, the pressure of living in Julian's shadow, and the desperate need he'd felt to be seen as something more than a disappointment. I told him about the girl I was before I met Julian, a girl who loved to paint, who had dreams of traveling the world with nothing but a backpack, a girl who had traded her soul for the illusion of safety. Do you regret it? He asked me one night, sitting on the edge of the motel bed, watching the rain streak the window. I thought about it for a long time. I thought about the cold marble of the mansion, the silent dinners, the way Julian looked at his watch during my birthday dinner. I thought about the red silk lingerie and the way it felt to finally be touched by someone who was actually present. I regret the pain, I said softly. I regret that it had to be you, because I know what it cost you. But I don't regret leaving. I was dying in that house, Leo. You didn't just see me. You saved me from disappearing entirely. Eventually, the time came for us to part ways. We both knew we couldn't stay together. Our connection was forged in trauma and rebellion. It wasn't the foundation for a life. He needed to find his own path, away from his father's shadow and away from the woman who reminded him of his greatest mistake. And I needed to find out who Elena was when she wasn't someone's wife or someone's scandal. I watched him board. A bus for the coast, heading toward a job a friend had offered him at a boatyard. We didn't kiss goodbye. We just hugged a long, tight embrace that whispered thank you and I'm sorry all at once. As the bus pulled away, I felt a sharp pang of loneliness, but it was a clean pain. It wasn't the doll. Aching out of the mansion, I took the remaining money and rented a small studio apartment in a part of the city where no one knew my name. It was one room with a slanted ceiling and a window that looked out over a community garden. It was tiny, humble, and entirely mine. I bought a set of cheap paints and a canvas. On the first night, I sat on the floor and painted. I didn't paint the mansion. I didn't paint Julian. I painted a woman standing on a bridge, watching the sun rise, her hair messy and her eyes bright with the terrifying beauty of the unknown. Months passed. The divorce was handled through a series of cold, impersonal emails from Julian's lawyers. He made sure I got nothing, no alimony, no assets, nothing but my freedom. I signed the papers without a second thought. I didn't want his money. I didn't want anything that smelled of that life. I got a job at a local gallery, clearing tables at the cafe and helping hang the exhibits. One afternoon, a woman stopped in front of a small canvas I had managed to get into a local artist's showcase. It was a painting of a red silk ribbon caught in a bramble bush, torn but still vibrant. "This is powerful," she said, looking at the signature. "Elena, is that you?" I nodded, a small, genuine smile tugging at my lips. "Yes, that's me." She looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time in my life, I didn't care about the wrinkles at the corners of my eyes or whether my hair was perfectly styled. I was a woman who had lived. I was a woman who had made mistakes, who had felt the fire, and who had crawled through the ashes to find herself. The story of the trophy wife in the sun eventually became a fading headline in the gossip columns of our old social circle, but in my new world, it didn't exist. I was no longer a character in Julian's story. I was the author of my own. Sometimes in the quiet of the evening, I look in my small, cracked bathroom mirror. I see the maturity of my years, the lines of experience, and the strength in my gaze. I don't wear red silk much anymore. I don't need to. Because now, when I look at my reflection, I don't need anyone else to tell me I'm beautiful. I know I am. And more importantly, I know I'm finally truly visible. If you've stayed with me until the end of this journey, perhaps you understand. Life isn't always a straight line, and sometimes the most beautiful things are born from the most chaotic moments. Thank you for listening to my story. Don't forget to follow for more tales of the human heart, and remember your reflection belongs to no one but you. Stay strong, stay visible, and I'll see you in the next story.